Tim, you have arrived with lunch.
I have arrived with food.
Yes. All right, so now we can chow, and then we can make the F12 straight, because unfortunately it is not straight, and we need it to be straight to dyno it. We also need it to be straight to track it. So we got some work ahead. We're gonna chow down on these. What'd you get? You got a plate or you got a burrito?
I got a plate. You got a burrito.
I got a burrito.
Ah,
Solid, hefty burrito from down the street, our favorite taco spot. All right, we're gonna chow on these things, and then I'm gonna show you guys how we're going to straighten this car out. The way it is, it's pretty crooked, and it's not gonna drive right. We're gonna tear up tires like crazy and not use the whole tire because it's not set up right. So we're gonna go through that process a little bit, kind of show you how we're gonna do it. And we're actually gonna use strings to do it. So it's kind of an interesting way to do it. It's very simple, but probably not what you'd expect. And race teams use this as well to straighten cars out. So this is how you do it at the track. It's a pretty cool setup. Yo, we got some goodies here. These are the left and right harnesses from Greg, who did the wire harness. And this is like the last piece that we need really to get everything working. So he was gonna just come down or bring him down when he came down for the dyno, but I figured just ship it over here. We can test fit him on the car. So if there is anything that isn't right, which there probably won't be, but we can let him know and either send him back to him and he can dial it in, or they're all good and we can just plug them in and be good to go. Dude, it's a lot of dollars in there. That looks sick. The attention to detail is so rad. Like every single piece of this is 100% custom made. It's literally just like the connector. Even the connector has the pieces that go together, like the back clamshell, the boot, all this stuff. Everything is hand built. So let's plug these things in. Let's figure out which side is which. That's pump, so that's probably the driver's side steering. Yep. So that's going to be this side. Trim that zip tie and trim this one.
Should we try to plug in the headlights and see if they work? Because I know that Shane programmed the taillights, but I don't remember if he was able to program the headlights because they weren't there.
I don't know if he did yet. So this says light on it, but it doesn't have the factory Ferrari plug on it yet. So what I'm guessing is he's going to take that piece of the factory plug when he's here and figure out which pin is what and then wire it up. So that's not going to work right now, unfortunately. That would be cool to see. But the actually the most important part of this harness is that one for the steering, and then this one right here, the oil temp.
Oh yeah, we haven't had that yet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously it hasn't gotten like super hot yet, so it hasn't been an issue. But the oil temperature sensor is actually in the bottom of this tank right there. So this is the dry sump tank, and because it's a dry sump system, all the oil is constantly being pumped out of the tank and into this container here, which lets it all kind of separate. It gets all the oil in one spot rather than having this big oil pan where you can have all this slosh. You get oil gets all foamy, and also as it's sloshing around, sometimes you get air in the pickup. So the pickup should be completely submerged in oil, so it's always 100% oil and not any air bubbles in it or any gaps of, big portions of air coming in, because obviously that would kill a bearing pretty fast. So dry sump systems eliminate that. But that being said, the oil temp sensor is here and not in the engine on the block. That part of the harness is done. But now we'll plug this thing in, see how it routes before we straighten the car out.
Oh, I guess another thing with them on is you can make a bracket for these probably, right? Because now we're waiting to see where these are.
Yeah, exactly. Figure out where they're going to go and how they're routed. Let's see.
Turbo shaft speed or something, right?
Yeah, it should be on here somewhere. Oh, lights, fans. Oh, intercooler fans are here. Well, let's put them on and see. Oh, these lights are actually for the
Underglow.
Underglow, yeah.
So that's not even the headlight.
Yeah, it might actually be, this might be underglow and under hood lighting, like a work light, because there's 3 wires in here. So you'd use a ground to both of them.
Oh yeah, so then
And you got 2 powers.
is this the headlight?
Oh, no, that's the turbo speed.
Oh, that's what we were looking for.
So that's right there. We got the ground wire here, which already has that ready to go. Those are the lights. There's our, yeah, that's our oil temp right there. Turn this boot.
I think you had it.
Well, the cutout, the notch is on the backside.
Oh,
so
so
that's
it's
going to point the
backwards.
wire. Well, but all you have to do is basically twist it in the boot.
Oh.
So inside, he's actually left enough room for strain. So instead of having the wires just super tight, they'll have little loops in there so that it can flex, it can move around, it can get pulled on a little bit, and it won't pull the wire out of the socket, which is really important. Obviously, you wouldn't know that anything was wrong if the wire was pulled out in there. You just would have something that's not working. So we got that plugged in. And then he also said he made them a little bit long since he wasn't here, but he can clean all this stuff up. So once we have it all routed, he can basically pull these back apart and shorten up the harness and then repin them, because that only takes a few minutes. So he'll make everything perfect when he comes back. So this is the initial fit of it all. All right, now we got this one that's gonna run forward. I'm gonna try to figure out what he planned, how he planned for it to go.
It kind of seems like it goes behind the drive. Maybe not.
Probably, I would say probably over here
Oh yeah.
along this bit.
On the back side of it.
Yep, and that keeps it pretty clear of everything. And then we have, that's the turbo speed sensor, that guy. And that's the headlights, and then these are the fans. So, fans, but maybe we might even spin this fan around so both the wires are coming out in the middle. So
Because
that
now they're really long.
Yeah, now they're definitely long. But like I said, he can always shorten these things up too. So we can figure out how it's gonna go.
Oh, we can test these.
Yeah. Let's see. I think it just needs a little bit of lube on there. So all of
it's
these,
really tight.
Yeah, all these have that silicone seal on them, and I think it's just sticking. So we'll get that on there in a minute. Let's see how the other side fits. Make sure that the steering pump wires and everything are good. Alright, same thing, we got the ground. We got the steering pump wires. Those look perfect. Right there. We got the lights. Oh, wiper. So we added basically wiring for a wiper. So if we ever do want to put wipers on the car, we've got that available. I'm going to do the same thing, run it to the front. We've got steering rack, so that's going to go down.
That's going to go all the way to the bottom.
Mm-hmm. And then, oh, he added this too. So he added a pump in case we needed to add a drain back pump for the turbos, because obviously we had that issue. We were able to solve it by welding some fittings into the front cover. So now the turbos drain into the front cover, which is kind of hard to see because there's so much stuff in there.
Yeah, maybe we won't be able to see it. Oh, there. They're right there.
There they are. So in case we weren't able to do that, he put some wiring in here to run an electric scavenge pump, which would suck all the oil out of the bottom of the turbos and then dump it back into the dry sump tank. But now we've got extra wiring in here that we can use for whatever else we want, really, if we ever need anything else. So we've got our headlights here, turbo speed. Okay, all looks good. Okay, cool. Well, now let's straighten this thing out. All right, so we are going to use this metal tubing here and some fishing line. straighten the car out. These things are actually called smart strings, and it is it's an alignment system. So we can get all the wheels pointing in the right direction. Obviously the car was completely disassembled. Every piece was off of the car. So the rear suspension is still all factory stuff, but it's not pointing in the right direction right now. It's got too much camber. It's got too much toe in. And then on the front end, I basically built the entire front suspension from scratch. And I built a lot of adjustability into it, which is awesome for tuning, but it does make setup quite a bit more difficult because you have so many points of adjustment. So instead of just having 1 point to move camber, 1 point to move caster, and the tie rods to adjust the toe, we now have, well, we can adjust caster with this lower link here. We can adjust camber by lengthening that and then resetting the caster by adjusting that. But we can also move caster by moving the upper A-arm forward or backwards, or lengthening or shortening these, which is going to twist it back or forth. So that's going to change the caster as well. Those will also change the trail of the knuckle, and there are a lot of terms that I'm using right now that you might not understand. So when you're looking at the front of the car is driving towards you, you see the camber is the wheels pointing towards each other at the top, so pointing in towards the engine basically, and that's negative camber. Pretty much every car you drive is going to have negative camber. Race cars are going to have a lot more negative camber, and it's really dependent on the tires that you're using. If you're using a street tire and you're on the street, you're probably going to want about 1 degree of camber. Some cars less, some cars more. It also depends on what the sweep of the suspension looks like. How much camber does it gain when you go into a corner and that corner starts to compress and roll over? If it gains a lot of camber, you don't need a lot of what you would call static camber, is what you would see when the car is just sitting there. So there's a lot to all of this, but these are all really important components of the suspension, and they really affect how the car drives, how the car feels, and in a drift car, how the car feels and how the steering feels as you're sliding and you're transitioning, and also throughout the steering sweep. So from when you're going straight to when you're sideways to when you're adding more angle, you can get it to where the suspension really changes a lot and does weird stuff, and it kind of binds up. There's a lot, like I said, a lot to it. But so we're gonna focus on the caster, we're gonna focus on the camber, which the camber on the front I have already set. We've got about 3 degrees right now, and that's a good starting point. We may go up to 4, we may go up to 4.5 when we actually do testing, but we'll start here at 3 and see how it works. As far as the caster goes, I have an idea of where I want it to start. So the first thing I did was I took a tape measure and just measured off a point on the chassis to a point which is the pivot point on there on both sides. So I want to make sure both sides, left and right, are the same, obviously. This isn't a circle track car, which you would actually stagger the suspension from the left and right. You kind of make those cars turn themselves, and you have to fight them back straight for the straightaways. They even have tire stagger. So the tires on the right side of the car will actually be a bigger diameter than the tires on the left side of the car. That would make the car turn left. So there's a lot of setup stuff in every different type of racing, every different type of track, different tires, different driver preferences. There's just so much to it, but not getting too much into that. I'll show you guys how to set up with strings, because you can do this at home. You can actually align your own car in your garage or in your driveway with either a set of strings like this, or this costs a few $100. If you don't want to spend that money, you can literally do it with 4 jack stands and some fishing string and a tape measure or a ruler. The idea is you basically use this stuff or jack stands, and you create a box around the car. So if we were looking directly from above, we would want a perfect rectangle all the way around the car. And what that does, if the middle of that box is dead center in the middle of the car, then you can see which way the wheels are pointing. Now with the strings, we're only gonna be able to set toe. So that's as you're driving, if the wheels are pointing straight ahead on the road or pointing out, which is toe out, or pointing in. So that's what you're gonna be able to adjust with the strings. And then for the camber and the caster, you actually use a digital camber gauge. They're not very expensive. At the track, I have actually used my phone, which has like a level app. So you can check it out and get a pretty good reading of what your camber is. But we have one of these, a simple digital camber gauge. It's got these points that go onto the wheels. So you can just stick it on the wheel and read the camber directly off the wheel. And then also, as you put this on the wheel and then you turn the front wheels, you do some math, and that's gonna give you the caster readings on that wheel. Now, caster is, when you think about a shopping cart and how the wheels hang back and how they always track straight, that's the caster. If the wheels are dead center, there's zero caster, and you get that kind of wobble because the wheel doesn't know which way to go. It's right in the middle of the pivot point. So you can move it and you can put trail in it, which is what a shopping cart is, where where you push it is where you want to go. You can flip it around the other way, and that would be dependent on how much caster you have. So we'll get this thing set up and show you guys what it looks like with this box around the car. It's a pretty cool bit of knowledge to have, even if you never do it, just to understand why it could affect your car as you're driving down the road. And you can understand if you need an alignment, you can look at your tire wear and say, oh yeah, that's what's going on. And if you also understand, you can look and see which way your tire is pointing, just visually, you can have a pretty good idea of what it's doing. Got the rear mostly set up, and it was a little bit tricky because we didn't really have anywhere for these things to grab for it to sit in the right place. We have no bumpers on the car. Obviously a lot of stuff is missing, and these are not something that is gonna fit perfectly on every single car, every single time. So we had to get a little bit creative and cut a piece of square tubing here and just stuck a couple C-clamps to hold it in place to give us a spot to grab it to. And now we have the bottom, whereas the actual like tube is gonna go. So we've got these, and these actually have machined grooves in them, so you can choose how wide to make it, and you can match it on the other side, so it's equal. So that's basically ready to go on the back. In the front, unfortunately, we have another issue. The intercooler is so big, and it sticks out past the front of the car, so the strings won't connect here. I could go to the sides, but then it's too wide, and the fixture just doesn't fit. So I gotta figure something out for that. But first, before we get that part set up, I wanna start with the camber in the rear. And we don't need the strings on to set the camber because they're just gonna kind of get in the way. The camber adjustment on the car is basically non-existent. The control arms bolt to it, and we'll have to make some shims to move it out. The car's quite a bit lower than it was from the factory. So we have a lot of camber because of the camber gain. So I think I'm gonna draw up a camber shim because I know we're gonna need them for sure. So we're gonna pull that wheel off and check that out, and I'll show you what part we're gonna move on the suspension to take some camber out of this thing. All right, so we've got just this one upper link, and since I wanna take camber out of the car, it's got too much negative camber, so the top of the wheels are pointing towards each other. So we're just gonna basically use the inside of the tire when we start driving, and it's gonna wear it out really fast, especially with drifting. So we wanna get probably about a half a degree to a degree of camber total in the car. And I'm guessing it probably has about 2.5 degrees right now, maybe even 3 degrees. If it didn't have any camber and I wanted to add camber to it, I'd make shims for the lower control arms and push the lower control arm out, which would give us more negative camber. But since I want the opposite of that, I want to make the top arm longer. So I need to make a shim that goes between the chassis and this mount here. So I'm going to figure out what that looks like. This is zeroed out on that bolt, so I can go across and figure out what the hole-to-hole center is on these things. And it is 84.5 millimeters. I'll double check that, but it looks like, yeah, it's 84.5. So now I know that that's my spread. Now I'll see how wide it needs to be here, and obviously not make it too wide to where it's gonna hit this. Figure out the height of this. I'm probably gonna slide them in from the bottom because coming in from the top, there's no room. So I'll make them so they come in from the bottom, but I need to have this kind of like window cut out here. So it'll look a bit like a horseshoe. I'm gonna draw that up real quick and then go to the plasma table, cut those out in some different sizes. I'll probably do a couple in 3/16 and then do some in 1/8 and then do some in 0.65. So I have like a range of shims to add or take away to get the camber that we want. And I want to have some extra because if we want to change the camber when we start driving it or when we go to different places and different ride heights or whatever, we have adjustability. All right, got a stack of different thickness camber shims now. So we will start with one side and take this upper link off, pop these on there, obviously behind it, so it sandwiches in place, and then we will see what that does for the camber. We'll just do that on one side and then see where we're at so we know how many shims we need to add to the other side rather than trying to guess on both sides, and having to do both at the same time just doesn't make any sense. All right, those shims are in there now. We took the top bolt out and those two nuts. So we popped it off, slid those in. I also cracked the tie rod loose and made this a bit longer because when I make that arm longer, without making the tie rod longer, it's going to push the top out, but the back is gonna stay in, and then it's gonna push the front of the wheel out. So we're gonna get a lot of toe out. Ooh, that's loud. Just took a guess on how many turns to do just to kind of get it close. You can actually affect the camber when you have a huge difference in toe. So you need to have it pretty close to being 0 toe for the camber reading to be correct. If you have a bunch of toe in or a bunch of toe out, you might read the camber and then you adjust the toe, and now the camber is a 1/2 degree or 3/4 of a degree different than how you had originally thought it was or originally tried to set it up to. So we have this side that we have not touched yet, and we are at about 2.3 degrees of negative camber. So we would need that much movement to get it to be 0. Now we want about 1/2 to 1 degree, somewhere in that range, probably go about 0.8. So we need about a finger's width to move that. But since that upper control arm is kind of halfway between where the tire is here and where the center is, we'll need about 1/2 of as much movement. So let's see on the other side where we put those shims in, where we're at right now. So this thing to sit nice and flat. A little bit off there. There we go. You got to make sure that you're in the same spot on the top and the bottom. I'd say that's pretty spot on. We're at 0.8. So we went from 2.3 to 0.8 with those two shims that we added in there. So now we'll put those shims on the other side so we can match it up. Also, kind of eyeballing where the toe is right now. It looks pretty good. So I did 5 turns of adjustment on the toe to get it kind of straightened out. So we'll do the same to the other side, and then we're ready to put the strings on this thing and make this thing nice and square and nice and straight. All right, so now that we have the camber set, the next step is to set the height of the strings, basically where these poles are gonna be, to the center of the wheels, right in the middle of the hub. So I'm just gonna measure that height, and that's right around 40 centimeters. So I'll measure these, the same thing, and I'll set that height to the top So that way when the strings go across, the strings are actually in the middle of the wheel. So the camber doesn't affect it at all. So we'll set that up right now. And then in the front, we're gonna have to do something a little bit different because we couldn't get the strings to fit. So I got some pieces of wood and cut a hole here, basically a slot, so I can clamp these onto the front and hold them where we need it. It's gonna be a little bit of a pain, but it'll work for now. And then eventually I'll make something that just bolts onto the front of this car so we can do the alignment and it's gonna work all the time in the same exact spot, basically just custom built something for this exact car. We got the strings on the car, and the next step after making sure that the poles are basically level and not crooked from side to side, and making sure that the string is in the middle of the hubs. So we are obviously a different size tire in the front and in the rear, so it's at a different height, but the string passes through the front wheel and the rear wheel right in the center of the hubs. Next step is to make sure that the box, basically the strings, are set up correctly so you're in the same spot on all those corners. We're on the outside edge because this car is so wide. We might be able to go in and have it really close, but right now the toe is off. It was actually touching the tire, so we went out to the furthest point, and now we need to check with a ruler. You can do it with a tape measure too, but I'm basically going to come and go to the middle of the hub here and measure out. So we're at about 202 millimeters here. We'll go over to the other side and check that. And we want those numbers to be the same on each axle. The front track width and the rear track widths are different, so you're gonna have different numbers. But on that same axle, you want it to be the same reading. So we're only at like 186 over here, and we were at 202 on the other side. So we need to come out a bit. All right, let's see where we're at on the other side. And as you can see, we got the front kind of, well, it's set up for now. And it's working. And that's what really matters. So we were at what, 194 on the other side?
Yeah.
And we're at 196. So we need to go to 195. And we're at 195. I'm not even gonna bother checking the other side yet, because if the rear is off, it's gonna throw off the front readings too. So the first couple times you're kind of going back and forth and getting it close, and then you'll come back and do that fine tuning to get it within that 0.5 millimeter. So in the rear, 192. And on this side, oh, just like 202. So we need to move about 192, about 5 millimeters. So I moved it about 5 millimeters. I'll check this side, then I'm gonna go back to the front, dial the front in again, go back to the rear, dial the rear in, go back to front, and just till I make sure that it's perfect. All right, so next thing I'm gonna do is just make sure that the wheel is pointing straight up and down, because now we're gonna set the toe dependent on the steering wheel. If you're just using toe plates, which you might have seen us use before, just to do the initial setup, that isn't checking to see where the steering wheel is. So it might be both wheels are crooked and you're getting a good reading, but now we actually have that square box set up around the car, or rectangular box. So we can actually see steering wheel is straight, this wheel is off, or this wheel is off, or they're both off, but whatever it is, we'll want to make sure that that steering wheel stays centered up so we don't have a crooked steering wheel when we're all done with this. Now visually, you can see already that where we're at here with the wheel, we've got that much space in the front and that much space in the rear. So that means we've got quite a bit of toe out on this side. Let me go check this one, because I thought we did get it fairly close. And yep, it looks like we've got about the 3-finger gap here and 2-finger gap in the back, which means the steering rack is not centered and the steering wheel is off by 1 spline. So I'm gonna move that to the next click over, center it back up, and then see where we're at. It could be off, like I said, because we did only set it up with the toe plates. So it very well could be off. But I believe we centered up the rack last time. And since we don't have any rack boots on here, that's another thing. You guys might look and see that there's no steering rack boots, and that's not right. Well, in drifting, you move the steering wheel back and forth so much that you actually need a big hole in that steering rack boot. Otherwise, that accordion, basically you'll create a bunch of vacuum on one way when you pull it out, and it'll suck in. And then as you go back the other way, a bunch of pressure, and it'll just crack the boots immediately. Also, we're always checking the tie rods, and we're always servicing it. So it's just better to leave the boots off, because like I said, the size hole that you need for it to work and not collapse and just destroy the boot is pretty big, which just means dirt gets in, except now you have dirt that's getting into somewhere that has a boot on it. So all that dirt is staying in there, and you're not looking at it, you're not wiping it off, you're not cleaning it, you're not re-greasing it. So it is better, even though it's open, just to leave it open. All right, now the steering wheel is centered. Move to that one notch, turn the wheel. That looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to measure from the front of the rim here and see where we're at. We're at about 58. Come to the back, and we're about 54. So there's 4 millimeters, but divided in two, so there's a 2 millimeter difference. The measurement in the front is bigger, which means that we have toe in on this side by about 2 millimeters. We're gonna go and check the other side and see where we're at. And here we're at 52, and we're at over 60, 62 almost. So we're about 5 millimeters off there. So now what we'll do is just adjust the tie rods. So make a quick adjustment there, and that'll move this wheel. We'll go back, make sure the steering wheel's still centered, do the other side until we get those zeroed. I always like to start with it at 0 and then check the wheel again, and then make the same amount of turns on each side to get the even amount of toe that we want. If you go over here and you adjust one side and you lock it down, you go, okay, I have my 1 millimeter toe out, or my 1 millimeter toe in, or whatever you might want. You go to the other side and you do that, and you get the wheel to be a bit crooked. So zero it up, wiggle the steering wheel, put it back to center, zero them up again, make sure it's 0, and then you do the same amount of turns on both sides to get that perfectly even centered steering wheel. Okay, and crack that loose. Go here and do the same on the other side. Now on this setup, we do have another spot where we can move the toe because we have that heim joint on the outside, but it's better to just have one point that's moving. If you have 2 of them, then for every little adjustment you do on that aluminum connector piece, it's gonna make it twice as fast, or close to twice as fast, depending on the thread pitch. So I wanna eliminate that and just have that one point that moves, and really simplify everything. So as I'm turning this, I can feel that the tire is not turning. So I'm pretty sure that the steering wheel is the one that's turning. So I'm gonna make a little bit of adjustment here, a little bit of adjustment on that side, and then I'll turn the wheel again and center it up. We don't have any scale boxes. We should get some scale boxes eventually for setting things up in scales. And also on there, you would build some slip plates, which really easy way to do it is either 2 plates of aluminum with some grease in the middle so they can slide. So as you're making the changes, the wheels can settle and basically not have any load on them. And a really quick, easy, dirty track style way to do it is literally a Ziploc bag with a little grease in it, like a little bit of grease, just a smear of grease. And then you close it up, and that plastic bag will actually give you that slip. But being on these boxes that have these holes in them, it won't work. This is just the baseline initial setup, and we will get some scale boxes so I can do this properly and replicate the setup. But we're at such a beginning point right now that if it's off by a 0.5 millimeter or something, it's not really gonna matter. We're gonna go out, we're gonna test it, we're gonna try different things. So we're gonna do this a lot of times, basically. Front end is dialed in. We've got about 1.5 millimeters of toe out, and that's what I want to start out with. We might go more toe out, we might go closer to 0, it all depends. We also have some stuff that we can change in the front end. Obviously all that adjustability. We can also change the Ackerman, which is what the wheels do as they turn. We can go full parallel. We can go with some Ackerman, negative Ackerman, which makes the car drive a little bit better, gives you a little bit better steering feel, better return in the wheel. When you do a transition, the wheel will kind of walk itself over. And we do those by changing these little shims on the outside where the tie rods go. So we have that adjustability as well. You can kind of control the Ackerman a bit without those by changing the toe, but obviously if you put a bunch of toe out in it, when it's static, when you're driving straight, the car is gonna be really squirrely and hard to drive. It's not gonna feel great. It's not gonna give you a lot of confidence to accelerate to 100 miles an hour while the car is trying to kill you while you're doing that. So that's why we have the other adjustment, and we don't go with a lot of toe out in the front end static. Some drift cars do. Hopefully on this one, we won't. But we never want that positive, because that gives you this bind in the front end, and the front of the car is trying to slow down faster than the rear car, and the car will want to over rotate. So it's really hard to drive and it's really hard to catch. So anyway, now that we're done with the front, we'll get into all this stuff later when we're testing the car and dialing it in, so you guys can actually see what's going on and see the inputs inside the car, seeing what we're having to do to drive it, and then the changes that we make to fix those issues. But front end is done, so we're gonna move on to the rear, and same thing, we're just gonna measure the front distance, about 118 there, and then here, we've got about 108. So we've got about 10 mil difference pointing in the front end, about 5 millimeters of toe in, which is probably a bit too much to start out with. Not terrible, but the more toe in that you put in the rear, the more the car is gonna react to the throttle inputs and kind of lurch forward. So if you have a ton of toe in, every time you give it throttle, it's gonna kind of jump forward. And we want it to be really smooth. We don't need it to be incredibly gripped up like a Formula Drift Pro car would be, where you want to just shoot up to somebody else's door, but it makes it really hard to drive. So it's that balance. That's going to be a little too aggressive to start with. Also, I haven't run this rear suspension through its complete cycle and measured to see what the toe does. It looks like it gains a bit of toe as it compresses, which means as you're on the throttle and you give it more throttle, it's already gonna give you toe in. So we don't need to have a bunch of static toe. Like I said, I'll measure that sweep and record all that data so we know different ride heights and what that sweep looks like, which just helps us in the setup of the car later on. But this is pretty simple. So we've got a little bit too much here, and we've got the tie rod right back here. So we can just turn this tie rod, and we want less toe in. So we're actually going to tighten this a little bit, and then I'm gonna come back here and measure it again. And now we're at about 1.9 here. So we're moving in the right direction. It's gonna take a couple more turns though.
This is a lot easier because they're not connected to each other like the front.
Exactly, so one change just changes this corner and doesn't affect the other side. Let's see what that did. And so now we're at 111, and we are at about 115 and a half. So basically I have about 2.5 millimeters of toe in now, which I think is good. I think that's where we're gonna leave it. So I'll leave this side alone and I'll go do the other side. All right, so now that we have all the wheels pointing in the right direction, all the camber in the right direction, now I'm gonna go through and do the caster. Now, I'll explain to you guys how that works, but watching it is probably gonna be another 20, 30, 40 minutes of going through this process to get that dialed in exactly. So basically the process is to put that camber gauge onto the wheel. Now we know it's 3 degrees here. Then we move the steering 20 degrees in this direction. We take that reading, we move it 20 degrees in the other direction. We take that reading, and then there's a math equation that you can use. If you want to do it yourself, you can find that on the internet. Do a search, how to check caster with a camber gauge. It's pretty straightforward. And then at that point, we would just move this lower link. So we move that lower link tighten it or loosen it, that's gonna pull it closer or farther and basically move the wheel, the bottom of the wheel, forward or backwards. So if we have the wheel like this, that's gonna be the caster that we want. We never want caster going in that direction. That's a shopping cart. So we want it moving in this direction and dialing it in. Now, the caster that I'm gonna shoot for on this car is gonna be way different than what you would shoot for on your street car. Or if you have a drift car and you have some angle kit, every angle kit is different and it all is gonna be determined on your driving style, the steering feel you like, obviously the geometry of that angle kit. There's so many factors, even ride height, roll centers, there's a lot that's gonna play into that. I have a starting point that I'm gonna go with on here and we'll set that up and then it might be off by 2 degrees. It might be off by less, it might be off by a little more. I hope it's not off by more because it's kind of a lot. But we'll dial that in. And once we get that set, then we'll come back to check the camber again, make sure it's still where we want it. Check the toe again, make sure it's still where we want it. Because as we move that link, it also, obviously, that's connected to the tie rod. So the more we pull this forward, this angle is gonna change on the tie rod and it can change the toe slightly. If we have to do 1 or 2 turns there, it probably won't affect the toe. But if we have to do 5 turns and we move the bottom of the wheel forward 5, 6, 7 millimeters, it's gonna affect the toe a bit. So we'll dial all that in and lock everything down, make sure all the adjuster screws are nice and snug so nothing moves while we're driving the car, and we should be good to go. We'll be good to hit the dyno, and now it's gonna be a lot better because the wheels aren't super cambered in. We are gonna use actually Dyno packs, mainline dyno, that bolts onto the hubs. So instead of it being a roller dyno where the tires are on the dyno, that's good for a quick horsepower reading. But to really tune the car with the Dyno packs or with the mainline bolt-on hub dynos, we can do a lot of really cool things that you guys will see in that video. Also, we eliminate the possibility of tire slip coming into play. Obviously, with a car that's gonna make as much power as this is, we're gonna have some issues with a grip on that drum roller like a Dyno Jet would have. So all that to say, we're getting really close. This thing is straight now. It will drive straight. And that's important, like I said, because when this thing is done and off of the dyno, Damon's gonna wanna shred some tires as soon as it comes off the dyno. I mean, probably in the parking lot at the dyno. I don't know if that's gonna happen. We'll see. It's a possibility. But if not, when we get back here to the block, could be the same day, it could be the next morning. But either way, as soon as we're done with the dyno, this thing will be shredding tires at the block. And then shortly after, it will be annihilating these tires, these X-Comp tires at the racetrack. So I am really looking forward to that, and that is coming up really soon.